and that I mean, we could come up with some language. It'll just the main thing is make sure you go back to the board and have their approval prior to. Bring it on. But you're saving 61%. So, it's a win-win. So, Are you intend to pay down day one or the potential savings or pay down monthly or annually for savings? But I mean, let's say they come up with some idea that's going to save us $100,000 a year, 25 years. All right, so how much are you paying for that savings?
Well, we make that decision to even though they're asking for monthly or whatever. Well, they're
okay, so it's terminates at 36 cents. It's just a matter of communicating what the intent is and get it prior to implementing that savings.
It's one of those strange things when their work results in a number that they use to calculate.
Yeah, well, yeah.
That's what it really is.
Well, the other thing is, Melissa she is good. We're just going to have to figure out how to.
Now I know why.
Going to choose someone.
Doesn't make any sense. It's contradictory statements. In one statement, contradicts himself twice in this.
Yeah, I know. Where are you at?
We're back in regular session. We had one executive session item. It was information only. Correct, Counselor? And so we will now move to the regular agenda. Item 8, Board of Supervisors, sitting as Board of Supervisors, approval of the consent calendar. What's the pleasure of Supervisor Carey?
Madam Chair, I would like to move the consent calendar in its entirety
As amended.
as amended, and thankful for the Rotary Club of Green Valley's efforts on the special amendment purposes.
A motion and a second to move consent in its entirety. Are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. We'll move on to item 9 under County Administrator, Unfinished Business, Star Valley Development. Mr. Huckleberry, you'd ask that this item be removed from the agenda?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd ask this item be removed, and we will return pending decisions of the Superior Court.
Is there a motion to remove the item from the agenda?
So second.
Motion and a second. Any objection? We will remove the item from the agenda then. Moving on to Community Development and Neighborhood Conservation, item 10, Alford Court Rental Housing Project and Resolution number 2015-3. What's pleasure of the board?
Madam Chair,
Supervisor Miller.
I'll move to approve resolution number 2015-3, allocation of the $100,000 of the Housing and Urban Development Home Investment Partnership Program funds for Alfred Court rental housing.
Is there a second? A motion and a second to approve. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. We're now on hearings. Item 11 has been continued until the meeting of February 3rd to meet the statutory advertising requirements. So we now move on to Development Services, item 12, rezoning CO9-14-13. Staff report.
Madam Chair, members of the board, before you request for rezoning of approximately 0.6 acres from GR1 Gateway to CB1 Gateway, located in Catalina on the west side of North Oracle Road, approximately 230 feet east of Pinal Street. To date, staff has received no public comment. Both the Planning and Zoning Commission and staff is recommending approval with rezoning conditions, and the property is located outside the Medine Marie Behan Conservation Land System, and that concludes the staff report.
Thank you. Are there any questions of staff? Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to address us in opposition to this item? If not, what's the pleasure of the board?
Madam Chair,
Supervisor Miller.
I move we close the public hearing CO9-14-13, TOMBO 51 LLC and North Oracle Road rezoning, and approve the rezoning of approximately 0.61 acres from GR1 GZ1 Rural Residential Urban Gateway Overlay Zone to the CB1 GZ1 Local Business Urban Gateway Overlay is recommended for approval with standard and special conditions by the Planning and Zoning Commission, and as recommended for approval with standard and special conditions as recommended by staff.
Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second to close public hearing and approve rezoning CO9-14-13. Are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to item 13, it's a rezoning closure for CO9-99-15, and staff is recommending closure. What's the pleasure of the board?
Madam Chair,
Supervisor Miller.
I move we close the public hearing and close CO9-99-15 Gatsonius Brothers Family Partnership, Cab Produce Company, Orange Grove Road number 2, rezoning for approximately 10.15 acres from SR to Suburban Ranch to Transitional TR as recommended for closure by staff.
Second? Second, was that super?
That was my second.
Okay.
Mr. Lucera's in the audience.
And he had indicated he would only speak if necessary to answer any questions.
I think he gave me the word over one side. I'm not sure.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. If there are no objections, motion carries. Development agreement, item 14, resolution 2015-4, authorizing the execution of a development agreement with Farmers Investment Company regarding Continental Farms specific plan. This is a public hearing. What's the pleasure of the board?
Madam Chair,
Supervisor Carroll.
will there be a presentation? Is it necessary from a county staff perspective on this item, Chris?
Madam Chair, Supervisor Carroll, there is one point I wanted to get in the record, and that is on behalf of the coalition, they had requested that there is a reference that the applicant in the county would probably have to work with multiple other jurisdictions for the flood improvement, and would work with others, and the others, I want to get on the record, will include the Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection.
There's no objection from the developer? Thank you.
Hearing that, I would move to close the public hearing and approve the development agreement resolution 2015-4.
Second.
Farmers Investment Company and the Continental Farmers Specific Plan, CO 23-13-01.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Do we have any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to traffic ordinance and ordinance 2015-4. Is there anyone in the audience that wishes to address us on this item? If not, Supervisor Carroll.
Madam Chair, I'd like to close the public hearing and go ahead and move traffic ordinance number 2015-4, regulating parking on Esperanza Boulevard in Green Valley, Pima County, Arizona.
I'll second. There's motion and a second. Objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to the addendum. Board of Supervisors sitting as other boards, in this instance the Stadium District Board. Item 1, contract with Pinnacle Concession. What's the pleasure of the board? Supervisor Valadez.
Madam Chair, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and make a point and move the item. During last year, when the Mexican baseball teams were in town, I think one of the things that we need to have staff at Stadium District do is take a look at how concessions are being handled going forward. Because one of the things that happened is that during those games, only some of the concession stands were open, and it wasn't concessions were not being provided universally throughout the stadium. Now, that may not be such a big deal, except for the fact that everyone who was there thought that the county was doing that. So that being the case, I think we need to, going forward, take a look at how that is handled in such a manner that's handled the same way every single time. So with that, I move the item.
Second.
Madam Chair,
Supervisor Millen.
just a comment on that. Do we have a specific, or maybe we need to add that language in the contract to ensure that that happens? Because I agree with you, that does reflect on us. So I don't know if the language in the contract has that information in there, how they handle this.
What I'd like to do is have staff take a look at an overall perspective, and I don't know if this specific contract is the right place for it. Mr. Osbury, does this contract preclude us doing such acts in the future?
Madam Chair, members of the board, no, it would not. And I think it's probably in all our interest to make sure every concession stand is open to the extent possible, because wait lines tend to defer acquisitions.
It's in their best interest as well.
Yes.
So that would be good. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Any objections? One objection. Any further objection? Hearing none, motion carries 4-1 with Supervisor Elias voting nay. Moving on to item 2, clarification of public participation in Board of Supervisors meeting. I want to, number 1, thank Supervisor Miller for putting this on the agenda, and again want to apologize to Mr. Cole and Ms. Michaels that you weren't able to speak last time. We are putting clarifying language on regarding this policy on the Board of Supervisors agenda, starting with our February 3rd meeting, and I want to thank you both for bringing that to my attention. With that, Supervisor Miller.
Madam Chair, thank you, and I would like to just that was my whole point, was to get the rules clarified so the individuals who do come down take the time to drive down here to do their civic duty and participate in governance aren't denied their opportunity to speak. I would first like to point out that our speaker cards need to be updated because they are incorrect, so they allow people to check a specific agenda item without saying only public hearings, and also it says you speak at the end of the meeting, so that's one item. And then I would like to point out again, as Ms. Michaels recommended, that maybe we put hearings on the side of each item so that the audience is very aware of that. And just last week what happened, individuals from one non-public hearing were allowed to speak on the foreign trade zone. And I understand, that was a very important decision on the county. However, we need to be consistent. And so I'm not sure, I know there are times when we're going to want to hear from folks like that, and maybe that would be presented as a public hearing possibly. I'm not sure how that would be handled.
Robert's rules, it's at the discretion of the chair, so that we would then indicate on the agenda item that the public would be allowed to speak. It's probably the best way to handle that, but.
And that is the one thing I did want to point out. It is at the discretion of the chair. The chair is the one who makes the decision on whether people speak at all. So that is in Robert's rules, and that is very important to note. And then the other thing, our own board policy needs to be updated, I think, because
Which policy?
here, it's policy item K, participation by employees in public. And if you go down to questions, item 6 says the members of the board and staff members on the dais may ask questions and make appropriate comments. I know that we're not allowed to comment back to individuals speaking unless it is a public hearing. Yeah, but this item 6 doesn't specify that, so maybe an update on that.
Okay.
And then
let me ask Robin quickly, or Mr. Grove, this is a policy, so it needs to come back to us as a language change for adoption. Okay, go ahead, Supervisor Miller.
And then again, we all know, and I think it's really important for people to note, it is the discretion of the chair of the board on these items. And while I think last week that maybe there was a misunderstanding and some people were allowed to speak on non-public hearings, but I think that may be possibly a way to handle it in the future so that we don't have that confusion. And I do respect your position and will obviously adhere to your rulings. I am simply just asking for clarification and hope that we consider being consistent, and I think possibly putting those in public hearings may help. With that being said, I move that we direct staff to change the speaker cards to reflect the rules, specifically stating when you are and are not allowed to speak, and I think mostly it's open call to the public, and that it is, I think there needs to be an item on there, and I don't know if it's already on there, I didn't review the card completely, but it needs to be pointed out that it is at the discretion of the chair, whether you are allowed to speak on an item. I think that's very important to note that the chair has that power on the board. And I, again, move that the clerk of the board post a public hearing on each item that is a public hearing separately, because when you put it at the top of the page, it's really easy to miss. I know it is as a board member, I've missed it myself.
Okay.
And then change our board policy, as I described just a minute ago, to reflect the rules that stating speakers will be allowed to speak at non-public, will not be allowed to speak at non-public hearings per the discretion of the board chair. And speakers will be allowed to speak at open call.
Okay. And you realize as a policy, it's going to have to come back to us for approval, so they'll draft some language and then we'll work with that.
So I move that the board, directs the staff to come back with this language and then come back with the board for approval. Do we need a date certain?
We can probably do it February 3rd, if not the following meeting.
Whatever, Robin, February 3rd is fine with me.
And I think our policy, you need a second, I'll second the motion. I think our policy is reasonably liberal, and I know some of you probably don't like that word, but if you've been up to the state capitol or you in Congress, public is rarely allowed to speak, and when they are, even at hearings, it's at the discretion of the chair. So, but I think Supervisor Miller is right. We do, those who make the effort to come down here should have a venue to speak, and I appreciate you bringing that to it. And I think Supervisor Valdez, you have some comments.
Madam Chair, just a couple of suggestions. We may want to post that information not only in the change of the green card, but maybe right here so people are aware that they may not be able to speak. Furthermore, by way of suggestion, not necessarily an amendment, obviously, I think the clerk is aware of which ones are public hearings and which ones are not, so that if there's a speaker card that is not for a public hearing, it automatically goes in the stack for a call to the public.
If we're not going to want to
Correct.
speak.
That makes
Good point. Okay, good point.
I would allow that amendment, yeah.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, I'll call the question.
Yeah, I-
Supervisor Elias?
That's such a long rambling motion. Could somebody please repeat it and make sense of it?
Absolutely. I move that we direct the staff to change the speaker cards to reflect the rules, specifically stating that you will be allowed to speak in open call to public on any topic, and that it is the discretion of the chair whether you are allowed to speak on any other item that is not a public hearing. And I move that the clerk of the board to post the public hearing on each item on the agenda that is a public hearing, or actually I accept Supervisor Valadez's recommendation that if someone puts in a card to speak to a particular item that is not a public hearing, it automatically goes into the call to the audience. And I move that we change our board policy to reflect these rules, and that speakers will be allowed to speak at open call.
Okay, that's the motion on the floor. Are there any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to real property, item 3, Bureau of Land Management, Helmet Peak, A and B. What's the pleasure of the board on that item?
Second.
Motion and a second to approve items 3A and B, Bureau of Land Management, Helmet Peak. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to contracts and awards, information technology, items 4 and 5, City of Tucson and Motorola Inc., Solutions Inc. What's the pleasure of the board on these items?
I move approval on items 4 and 5.
Motion and a second to approve. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Item 6, procurement. This is an award for requisition 15-130, Arizona Communication Experts, Inc. What's the pleasure of the board?
I move approval.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Moving on to item 7, Farmers Investment Company, A and B. What's the pleasure of the board on this? Supervisor Carroll. 7A and B, there's a motion to approve 7A and B. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Under boards, commissions, and our committee, item 8, Merit System Commission and Law Enforcement Merit System Council, the appointment of Robert Fee. What's the pleasure of the board? Motion and a second to approve. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. Transportation, item 9, and traffic resolution 2015-5. I'll move the item and close the public hearing. Motion and a second. Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. That brings us to the end of today's session. There being no further business, this meeting stands adjourned without objection. We will see you on February 3rd.